Uh, as we get ready to get into that, there was a story that came to my mind as I thought about this passage that kind of helps us get in the mindset of it all. And it takes place in Matthew chapter 14. So it's, if you want to go back there, you can. But Matthew 14 is an important passage in Jesus' life because it helps us understand the importance of what the writer of Hebrews is talking about. In Matthew 14, it opens with John the Baptist being killed by Herod. If you remember the story, if you don't know the story, his wife's daughter danced for him, and he was extremely impressed, and he made this foolish statement. He says, "I'll give you anything you ask for, up to half the kingdom." And the daughter came back and said, "I want John the Baptist's head on a platter." And so he had John the Baptist executed out of that selfishness and jealousy of his wife. And in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus hears about John's death. And in verse 13, I believe it's Matthew 14:13, it says, Jesus withdrew to the other side to be for some time alone. I think there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, he wanted to go away and grieve the loss because John was his cousin. John was a very important person in his ministry, and to hear about his death, he needed some time to put that in perspective. But also, he wanted some time to be alone with his Father and spend time praying to get perspective and know where God wanted him to go with that. But the story goes on. By the time he gets to the other side, there is a multitude of people who are waiting for him. And instead of saying, "You guys just need to go away and leave me alone for a while," the story tells us that he took time to teach them. He took time to heal them. And at the end of that, he takes time to feed 5,000 people. And after the feeding, he sends them all away. And he continues on his desire to be alone. And he withdraws to a mountain, the mountainside, to be alone and spend time in prayer. And he tells his disciples to get into the boat and head back to Capernaum, and he would meet them there. Well, the story goes on. It says the disciples got in the boat, and as is often the case on Galilee, the winds off Mount Hermon stirred up, and a storm settled in on the sea. It was swamping the boat. They were not having easy time making it back across. It's 8 miles across the lake, and the waves were, it says, buffeting them, coming over the boat, and at the fourth watch of the night, which is 3 o'clock in the morning, we don't know what time they started, but 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus comes down and he sees them not making progress, and he begins walking on the water out to them. And the disciples see him, and their immediate response is, "It's a ghost." Now, to understand their terror at that, you need to understand anybody who worked on the sea at that time, any fisherman, anybody who owned a boat, if they saw a ghost on the waters, it was a mythical symbol that told them they were not going to survive the night. And so one can understand, seeing a ghost, they were struck with terror. And then Jesus said, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And that's where we come to the part of the story that I want us to really focus in on, because Peter's in the boat, and he says, "Lord, if it's you, call me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come," and Peter steps, he probably better than most of us, he stepped over the side of the boat and started walking on the water, and he was doing great until it says he began to see the waves. And the minute he began to see waves, he began to sink, and he cried out, "Jesus, or Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out his hand, pulled him up, and brought him back to the boat safely. Now, here's the point. We could talk about this a lot, about all that's involved in this, but here's the one thing I want us to take away from that story as we get ready to read what the writer of Hebrews tells us. Peter's problems began when he took his eyes off of Jesus and put them on the storm. When he stopped thinking about Jesus, his problems began, he began to sink. Now, if you look back at Hebrews chapter 3, let's listen to how the head of Hebrews puts this. He says, "Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus. The apostle and high priest whom we confess, he was faithful to the one who appointed him. Just as Moses was faithful in all God's house, Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. Just as the builder of a house was greater honor than the house itself, for every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house if we hold on to our courage and the hope which we boast. Now I want us to go back and get the very beginning. He starts with the word therefore. Now somebody once told us, and it's an old one, if you find a therefore, you need to ask what it's there for. And therefore refers back to everything he said before. From the very beginning of this book, the writer of Hebrews has been building a case for the superiority of Jesus. You remember last week we talked about Jesus being the final word. He was superior to the prophets. He was superior to the angels. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, he was superior to all men. Chapter 2 also has that interesting beginning. It says, let us pay careful attention lest we drift. And that's a caution to always remember, always be thinking about who Jesus is. And then he goes on down through this and he says, one of the things we need to remember is that Jesus is our high priest. He's the one who delivered us from death. If you look at verse 14 of chapter 2, it says, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Jesus, we need to think and focus on him because he is the one who saved us and delivered us from the fear of death. And therefore, he's going to build his case for Jesus as he moves on through. And the second phrase is holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling. He's talking to Christian brothers, and well, I'm sure the women were included too as they overheard, but you know, in New Testament time, women weren't necessarily addressed. But these are Jewish believers who have left behind their obedience to the law and given their faith to Jesus. He says, okay, this is your calling. You need to focus your attention on Jesus. For some reason, at some point, they had begun to take their eyes off of him. No details are given. It might have been because they were being persecuted. It might have been because their lives were turned around because other Jews didn't accept them. 100 other things could have happened, that they were suddenly beginning to take their eyes off Jesus and turn it back to the law. And the writer of Hebrews says, fix your eyes, fix your thoughts on Jesus. Now I want to take a moment, I want to break this down a little bit, because I want to begin, number one on your outline, is focus on Jesus in your thinking. In your thinking or your focus. Hey, we got any teenagers up there that play basketball? Who can tell me who the greatest free throw shooter is of all time? It's somebody you've never heard of. Never played a game of competitive basketball in his life. He was a kid who just shot basketball as a kid all through his life. His name was Ted St. Martin, and he set the record in 1996 as he sank 5,221 free throws without missing in 7 hours and 20 minutes. How does somebody do that? How does somebody, practice is one of them, but focus. You have to be so centered in on that rim 15 feet away consistently without any distractions to get that stroke down and get 5,002. I can't make 10 in a row. 5,221. That's focus. Now, as any of you know who've played basketball know that probably one of the most difficult things is to be on the free throw line during a game with the game on the line. What happens? Anybody ever watch a Blazer game and to see the people behind the goal shaking those rattle things and distracting them? Arizona State does it better than anybody. You ever watch an Arizona State game? They have a curtain set up right behind the basketball standard, and when the opposing team comes up to shoot a free throw, they have a surprise behind the curtain. One game it was, the swimmer. Set the record, so many records. Michael Phelps. When he got to shoot a free throw, he opened the curtain. Here's Michael Phelps in his swimsuit standing there, trying to distract the player. And they do all kinds of weird things to try and distract. And that's focus. It takes focus and a refusal to let anything distract you from what's going on. And he says, focus. Fix your thoughts. That is ponder. That is think about. That is fix your mind without being distracted on Jesus. I want you to know, if there's one thing that Satan is going to try to do in your life, and that is going to be try to distract your mind off of Jesus. He's going to do everything in his power to get you to divert your attention. And that can be a lot of things, like Colleen talked about, financial trouble. Man, you've been through that. You know how distracting it can be. It can be health. It can be family. It can be sports. It can be games on the game deck. And I know I'm meddling in some people's lives right now. But we can get so obsessed and so thinking about other things that don't really matter that we stop thinking about Jesus and we think about those things more than him. So I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, how much do I think about Jesus? How much of the time are my thoughts on him? Focus your minds on Jesus. And the writer of Hebrews back in chapter 12 offers Jesus as the great example of that. If you go back to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, he says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus. He's talking about running a race marked out for you, and he says, fix your eyes on Jesus because he is the perfect example of a guy who didn't allow distractions to happen in his life. I love the way it says it. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Think about Jesus' life. He lived with one thought in mind, one goal in mind. And what was that? Us, God's purpose. Were there any who ever tried to distract Jesus from that? And you think about the devil after his baptism. He goes in the wilderness 40 days without eating. The devil comes and tempts him, and that temptation was all aimed at distracting Jesus away from his purpose and getting him to go off on a different track. You think about the night Jesus told the disciples, I'm going to be betrayed and killed. And Peter comes to him and says, never, Lord, did not while I'm alive. And Peter says, get behind me, Satan, because you have the thoughts of men, not of God. Satan was using Peter to try and distract him away from his purpose. But Jesus kept that focus. Throughout his entire ministry, he had one thing in mind. My food is to do the will of the one who sent me. And as he made his way to Jerusalem, I think it's Matthew who says he set his eyes to go to Jerusalem, even though he knew what was going to happen. Focus. If we're going to be successful in our spiritual walk with Jesus, we need to keep our focus on him. What do we focus our thoughts on him? What do we think about when we think about Jesus? Keep your minds focused on him. But then he goes on to build that case a little bit more back in Hebrews chapter 3. He says, focus your thoughts on Jesus, and he tells us some things to focus on. Number one, he tells us to focus our eyes or our thoughts on who Jesus is. Focus your thoughts on on who, his role, what he is, and what he did. And he says, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle. Now, I don't know what you think of when you hear the word apostle. We probably think of the 12 men who followed Jesus and learned from him for 3 years. But the word actually means one who's sent. The sent one, the one who came from heaven by God to give us the message. He was sent by God. And Jesus emphasized it. You read through the book of John, the Gospel of John, and you will find 37 times where Jesus referred to himself as the one sent from above. Jesus understood he was on a mission. He came for one purpose. Jesus, and it says focus on the fact that he came. Focus that he was sent with a message that he was the message that God had for us. He also tells us to focus on the fact that he is our high priest. If you know anything about the Jewish faith, the Jewish worship at the temple, you know there's nobody who is more important than the high priest. The high priest regulated everything that went on in the temple. On the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice was offered, the blood was collected. It was the high priest who took that blood into the Holy of Holies before the ark, and he applied the blood to the ark to cover the sin of Israel. So a high priest, really, you could say Jesus is the one through whom we have access to God. The high priest is the only one who could give man access. And through Jesus, we have that confident access to him. I love the Latin word for priest, if you take time to look at it. And Latin word for priest literally means bridge builder. Jesus came as the one who builds the bridge between ourselves and God and gives us access. Our high priest speaks to us on God's behalf. John chapter 2, verse 1 says this: these things are written that you might not sin, but if you do sin, we have one who speaks to the Father on our behalf, Jesus, our high priest. Jesus, think about the fact that he is interceding for us. Think about it, that it's through him alone that we have that confidence. Hebrews 4:16 says, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. You understand that. Verse 14 says, therefore, since we have a great high priest. Therefore, since Jesus is our high priest, let us come to God with confidence. So focus your thoughts on who he is. He's your apostle. He's your high priest. And then he says he is also faithful. I don't know who picked out the songs, but the great is thy faithfulness couldn't have fit better for us than this. You know, great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. And you go all through the things that he has done for us and is doing for us, because he is who he says he is. He never wavered. He always does what he says he'll do. Now, it says Moses was faithful as well. But there were times when Moses didn't quite get it all right. Jesus never failed. He is faithful and will do all that he says. So think about his role. Think about who he is. But then he picks up another strand and he says, think about his honor. Think about his glory. Think about his greatness. He says, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house, Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. So let me ask another basketball question. Who's the greatest basketball player to ever live? You want to start an argument? There it is. These new guys, these young guys will tell you it's LeBron James and Kawhi Leonard. But there are of us who have a broader spectrum on basketball who might argue for men like Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robertson. And if you've never learned about Oscar Robertson, you need to go watch and see him play. There are some great players, and there's an argument about who the greatest is. And so when the writer of Hebrews writes to these Jewish people and says he is worthy of greater honor than Moses, In Jewish mind, those are, as you say, fighting words. Because in Jewish mind, there was no one greater than Moses. They almost exalted him to the place of deity. He was that important to them. And so he issues a challenge. He said, think about Jesus' greater worthiness of honor. And he gives us some reasons. I believe he was greater in his faithfulness. Jesus had been found greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. Now, a lot of us have seen a lot of fancy houses, a lot of nice houses, and we look, boy, that house is really nice. In Oregon Garden, there's a house there you can tour, and you can go through it. Nice house. But who gets the credit for that house? Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, the house may be nice, but it's the one who designs it and builds it that gets the honor. And that's Jesus, or the writer of Hebrews is saying, Moses established the house of Israel, but he was just part of the house. He was a stone in the whole makeup of the house of God. Jesus is the creator and designer. As the house of God, as the church today, Jesus is the builder. Jesus is the designer, and therefore he gets the credit and is worthy of credit beyond Moses. Think about his greatness as the builder of the house. Verse 4 says, every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Not only, we may go build a house, we may do something great in our lives, but God is always superior because he is the source of it all. Think about Jesus' greatness as the source. Focus on thinking about him in that way. And verse 5, Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what he would be said in the future, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. Notice the contrast. What was Moses? A servant in the house. Who's Jesus? A son over the house. Now, most of us haven't lived that kind of life where we know the protocols for servants. In that day, there were levels of servants. There were field servants. There were people who worked around the property. Then there were the house servants. And the house servants were privileged. They got to wear nicer clothes. They got better treatment. They were kind of respected by the people, their masters. And oftentimes the house servant looked down their nose at those who were working out in the fields because they were superior. Moses was a servant in the house of God. He had a high position. But focus on Jesus. He was the son over the house. Now, there's a vast difference between being a servant and a son. If you're a son in the house and you give an order to a servant, they're going to do it. They're going to carry out what the son asks them to do. There's an authority inherent with him. Jesus is a son over the house, not a servant, and therefore worthy of greater respect, greater honor. Focus on his superiority and greatness in contrast to Moses. Faithful as a son over God's house. And he says we are his house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. Focus your minds. Focus your thoughts on Jesus. Think about his role in your life. Focus on his greatness and give it to him. There is no more difficult challenge in life than our thought life. You agree with that? Your mind is something that takes discipline. It takes self-control to keep your eyes focused on Jesus. Just follow somebody down the highway one day and you'll know how easy it is to get your mind off what you're doing. Whether it's a phone or whether it's a radio or whatever, you have discipline to keep your eyes focused. It takes training. It takes a willingness to not be distracted. The same is true in our spiritual lives. Satan is going to try everything in his power to try and distract us. I want us to go back to Philippians chapter 4 because Paul writes there in regards to our thought life. As he writes these words, begin with verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. If you want to know what to focus on about Jesus, that's him. Jesus is every one of those qualities. And so Paul is telling us, keep your minds on Jesus. We often let so many things into our mind that cloud it and distract it. But Paul is telling us you want to be successful in your spiritual journey, focus on him. Keep your thoughts on him. I want to go back to the story of Peter again for just a few moments. If you look at that story, Peter is sinking, and I would imagine in those moments he said, I'm going to die. Life is over. I was foolish for stepping out of that boat. And as he sinks, he cries out these words, Lord, save me. And it says, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? That's one of the greatest verses in all of Scripture because it's our story. It's our story because every one of us have been to that place. We've all had our eyes on other things. We focus on our problems. We focus on the challenges of life, and we get our eyes off of Jesus. And when we do that, we begin to sink, and we begin to face the end of our lives. And Peter cried out, Lord, save me. And that is the message. Anyone who cries out to Jesus, Lord, save me. Jesus reaches out his hand and lifts us up and brings us safely to the boat. If you're here and have never cried out to Jesus, if you've never been in that place, you need to understand, if you are living outside of Jesus, you are in Peter's shoes at that moment. You're faced with a life that you cannot solve yourself. You're faced with an option that only one option exists, and that, Lord, I can't do this. I need you. And that's the greatness of Jesus, is that he came for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to reach out his hand and lift us up and bring us safely into his boat. That's the opportunity. Focus your thoughts on Jesus. He's the author and perfecter of our faith. Jesus is the one who came and died for us that we might live. Let's pray together. Father, thank you. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for lifting him up. I know in John it says, if I be lifted up, I will draw them into you. Father, help us to make that our goal and our desire in life. To lift up Jesus. To draw people's attention to him. To keep our eyes on him. No matter what we do as we go through this life. And Father, today as we come to your table, as we take these emblems, Father, help us to remember Jesus. Help us to focus on him, focus on his sacrifice, focus on his willingness to come to the cross to die, to pay for our sin, to let our sin weigh heavily on him that we might know his righteousness, that we might be lifted out of danger and placed on solid ground. Father, thank you for him. Thank you for the change he makes in our lives and can make if we allow him. We thank you in his holy name. Amen.
In the morning